Welcome to Decoding the Conflict Mindset, episode number 65 in season 4 of our history. I'm so delighted to have you join us today and to be part of a very pivotal and informational interview with Blaine Donais. Blaine is our next guest speaker, and he is the author of 2 books, Workplaces That Work, Engaging Unionized Employees, a third one, The Art and Science of Workplace Mediation. Blaine comes to us with a legacy of experiences and opportunities. He is a labor lawyer licensed in the country of Canada, living in Toronto, and a leading theorist and practitioner in workplace conflict management. Blaine and I go back a long ways, about 20 years ago, when I first met him in Toronto, teaching workplace mediation. And being a member of the local community, he was there to support us, and it's been a friendship and a professional engagement ever since. I was so pleased to see that he went on to found the Workplace Fairness Institute, which later was recoined as the Workplace Fairness International as their work and reputation grew globally. The Workplace Fairness International brings to you not only on-site work practices, interventions, trainings, and so forth, to redirect the culture of workplace conflict and all the things that come out of that: bullying, harassment, discrimination, and so forth. And he really is focused on, again, redirecting that workplace into a place of restoration and health, and also providing safety. He is recently and newly launching an online program for employers to navigate through some of these challenges, to equip them with the mindset about what changes they can make in the workplace. Not only is Blaine a licensed attorney and an active workplace mediator, he also teaches workplace conflict management at the University of Toronto, the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources. He serves as a board member at ADRIO, ADRIO, and co-chair of the Chartered Mediators Assessment Committee. So he has a passion, like I do, for resolving workplace conflict, getting into the minds of people in conflict, and really helping redirect. So stay tuned, don't go away, but there is time for you to reach out to your friends and colleagues and let them know about this very important interview with Blaine Donais, founder and president of Workplace Fairness International. So here's the countdown. You'll soon meet him. Again, subscribe if you haven't already. We'll continue to focus on workplace issues and have a series of exciting guests coming up to follow Blaine. And then our last one, Hannah Hassel-Ketzner, who also has written a book on seeking fairness at work. And so you can see fairness is a pretty important topic. So stay tuned. You won't want to miss this one. Dr. Debra Dupree, founder and host of Decoding the Conflict Mindset. Welcome to Decoding the Conflict Mindset. I'm Dr. Debra Dupree, the founder and host of Decoding the Conflict Mindset. Many people have a fear of conflict, and yet what I hope to achieve by having esteemed speakers and thought leaders from around the world is to influence and change the way we think about conflict. Instead of fearing conflict, how about let's embrace conflict? Adversity creates opportunity. What can we learn from what's going on? And so with that, I am delighted to bring to you today Blaine Donais. Blaine, welcome.
Thank you, Deborah. Nice to be here.
Thank you. Well, Blaine, you and I actually go back some 20 years ago, where we actually met in Toronto, where I was part of the Mediation Training Institute, delivering workplace mediation training, and you were one of our participants. And I know we hit it off and we had some conversations, and lo and behold, you went off and founded the Workplace Fairness International. I'm so impressed in following your work over the last 15 years since you started that, and I'm so delighted we finally have an opportunity to bring you on the DCM podcast. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
Great. Well, Blaine, there are several questions I have for you today and several things I want to bring out. And one of the things that I think is important, and particularly since I knew you before WFI, is what spawned this? Where's your head at, or where was your head at in launching this institute? And where were you then? Where are you today? And hopefully we'll continue some of the synergy about workplace fairness. So how did you make that whatever?
Well, it was an interesting journey to get here, and certainly even at the beginning of the journey, I always had a passion for justice, so I went to law school to pursue that passion, some of the work that I did in the law school, I was very fortunate to be asked to write a position paper for the Saskatchewan provincial government on the rule of law in the workplace. And this really started my journey in terms of thinking about what is going on in the workplace setting, what its its structural component, like how it is legally structured in the Western world. And then after I graduated from law school, I took a graduate degree in alternative dispute resolution. And this was at Osgoode Hall in Toronto. And I learned a lot about conflict and conflict in an organizational setting. And I started to compare these two things, and this led me to some conclusions about the relationship between fairness and conflict in the workplace setting, and led eventually to the writing of my first book, which is called Workplaces That Work. And this was Workplaces That Work is a kind of a study of how workplace leadership and organizations can understand how conflict works in their workplaces, and can understand the relationship between conflict and culture in their workplaces, and also how they can identify the systems in which conflict is managed in their workplaces, and then of course evaluate them. And this was a really interesting journey for me that led to the creation of what was originally the Workplace Fairness Institute. And over the past, in 2005, and over the past 20 years, almost 19 years, it has morphed into what we call Workplace Fairness International. So my practice, I did practice law, like straight out practiced as a labor and employment lawyer for a number of years, and it steadily moved into the world of conflict management with workplace restoration, workplace assessments, fairness assessments, health assessments, and investigations and that sort of thing. And so, we've, from there, the organization that I founded has trained hundreds and hundreds of conflict management practitioners, mostly in Canada, but really around the world. We have some people in Peru and some in Germany and so on, and it's really training them on what I consider to be a very important proposition, and that is that conflict is predictable. Conflict is predictable, it's manageable, it's forecastable, it's measurable, and proactively it can be managed. And so that's where we find ourselves here today.
Wow, I'm really intrigued because again, having met you so many years ago, and yet wasn't quite clear about this transition into Workplace Fairness Institute, and then your evolution into international. Um, I so appreciate and value your work because you brought an organization and a I want to say a way of thinking about it that makes sense. And so I want to ask you a question before my next question, in that you mentioned that conflict is predictable. And I think that most people would be shocked at that idea. And so
Mhm.
share with us your perspective about, what makes conflict predictable.
Well, this is where we get to the relationship between conflict and fairness.
Okay.
And those of us who have delved into the theory of conflict know that uh, conflict arises from a perceived injurious event.
Right.
So, and that's a word that's a phrase that has three words in it, and the first one is perceived.
Mm.
And so, how does an event become, perceived as injurious? Um, we're not talking about this is we don't go to work at a gladiator school. People aren't fighting each other with swords. How injury happens is that our sense of fairness gets
Mm.
violated, and often it's fairness toward ourselves, which
Mhm.
invokes it's a perceived injurious event. So because it's injurious, it invokes a fight flight response,
Mhm.
and then it evokes negative attributions toward the person or persons who have we've blamed for that injurious event, and then it escalates from there.
Mm.
Uh, and yeah, Rubin, Pruitt, and Kim in the book Social Conflict sort of map this out, these five transformations of
Mm.
conflict. Well,
Right.
those are all equally applicable to the workplace setting.
Yeah.
And so um, and so why it's predictable, in my view, is that if you have an organization that doesn't take care of fairness,
Mhm.
in the way that individuals in the workplace are treated, fairness in how people treat each other, and fairness in the differences, between different groups of employees in the workplace, conflict is going to arise. It is inevitable um, that it's going to arise. And so, how do you manage that? By focusing on fairness.
Yeah.
And we often talk about fairness as fairness in content, but what I'm very much focused on is fairness in process. And when we think about fairness and conflict, by the way, our definition of conflict has evolved from from some of the very good work that was done by Uri Breton Goldberg, for example, in
Mhm.
getting disputes resolved. Their definition of conflict required that the conflict be manifest, that it be a conflict between people, or a
Mm.
two-party manifest conflict. Our in our practices, we know that the most dangerous conflict is conflict that does not get manifested in that way, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And there's a relationship between that and fairness, because fairness creates psychological safety.
Right.
And with a lack of psychological safety, the conflict won't be manifest to two-party manifest conflict, because there's too much fear associated with it.
Right.
So, and all of this is predictable, and you don't even have to ask me to tell you that. In Canada, the National Standards Association has um, um, put together 13 psychosocial risk factors for psychological harm in the workplace. And literally all of them have to do with fairness.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, and this is something that I really firmly believe organizations can be very um, upfront about. That organizations have finance departments. The finance departments try to forecast the costs in their workplace.
Mhm.
We know that conflict happens. We never forecast the cost of conflict
Yeah.
in an
Yeah.
organization, right? Dana, who's familiar to both of us, was one of the pioneers in thinking about that. That yeah, you can assess the cost of conflict. You can
Yes.
forecast it, but much more importantly, you can do something about it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you can do something. In my view, the best managed conflict is conflict that never happened,
Yeah. I
right?
like that. I like that.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to just interject here. So, because, both of us, sort of had some foundation in Dr. Dan Dana's work, one of my early mentors in the field of conflict resolution. So, Dan, Dr. Dan, I know you're out there traveling. So if you're hearing this, I want to give tribute to you and adulation for, you sparked a mindset when I was up in Seattle at one point in 1999. No turning back. No
Yeah.
turning back.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Same
So,
here. Yeah.
yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you,
And
Deb. Yeah.
yeah. And because, yeah, he really pointed out, so many concrete ways of looking at conflict that were, like you said, measurable, and analyzable in terms of the cost. And I remember one quote he always said is that, managers often say, gosh, dealing with all this conflict, I'm not trained to do this. And it's like, well, how much time do you spend actually managing conflict? Gosh, about 30% of my day. Where's that in your job description? Where is that in your budget for managing your department? Not, so he was huge in getting organizations to think differently about conflict is natural, conflict's going to happen. And as a manager, as a leader, it's our responsibility to know how to manage it, redirect it, and keep people on track
Yeah.
for safety and fairness.
Well, and the thing is that we can see this, the difference between a manager of work and a manager of people. Managers of people don't have a lot of conflict in their organization, in their work groups.
Mhm.
And that's because not only do they know that conflict is going to happen, but they also know that there are certain things that they can do to reduce the risk of negative conflict from happening. And if they do it proactively, it just doesn't happen, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's two questions I have for you is that I do want our audience to hear your definition of workplace fairness because I've learned from another podcast guest, Hannah Hassel-Kelcher, that workplace fairness is actually one of the biggest contributors to organizational dysfunction, people's sense of unhappiness, their quiet quitting, and so what define workplace fairness for us so we have that foundation.
Yeah. So at its core, workplace fairness, or our definition of workplace fairness, comes from liberal democratic theory, John Rawls, Ronald Dworkin, fairness is justice, and it essentially means equity of concern and respect for each person in the workplace, regardless of their position in the workplace. So, and if we apply that principle, in applying that principle, that evokes three imperatives for us organizationally. The first one is communication, because so fairness demands that people are treated with enough dignity that they know what they need to know about the organization, about what's going on, so on, not just to do their jobs, but to make them feel a part of the success of the organization. There is a very interesting interview I heard on CBC Radio, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation Radio, the other day, from someone who said that safety requires inclusion. To feel safe in an organization,
Mm-hmm.
it requires inclusion. And so communication is a huge part of inclusion, as is the second imperative, which is some sense of collaboration. Showing value for human dignity means showing value for the opinions, so on and so forth, and the contributions that people can make. And the third imperative is what we call proactivity, or being proactive. So when those three things are combined, those are the three imperatives that come out of this principle of equity, of concern, and respect. And when they're applied to everything that goes on in the workplace, like all the processes, not just conflict management, but resource management, decision making, even hiring, and so on and so forth, project management, that it produces fairness.
Mm-hmm.
People feel engaged and included. By the way, engagement is one of the psychosocial risk factors that the National Standards Association in Canada has come up with. The lack of engagement causing psychological harm. And so, there is a relationship between involvement and influence and engagement and conflict and fairness, right? So this is why when I get asked the question, what is fairness? I hope people are kind of prepared for the complexity of that answer. Fairness requires us to get beyond a one sentence definition, to think in the workplace setting, right?
Yeah. And just to reiterate, the three pillars, shall we say, are inclusion, collaboration, and being proactive.
Yeah, communication, collaboration,
Okay.
and being proactive, and collaboration is really both communication and collaboration have encased within them inclusion. This is one of the purposes of communication and collaboration, is involvement, influence, right? Which is sort of perhaps when we think of these three terms, and I know we're going to talk about this, but we in Canada, we often refer to it as equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I understand in the United States, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm not sure what the reason for that is, but in my view, the part that is often overlooked is the inclusion part. So diversity can be managed by sort of hiring practices and that sort of thing, and equity can be managed by pay practices and so on.
Right.
But inclusion actually requires an organization, the organizational leadership, to progress beyond their bare legal rights to make decisions, to progress beyond that, to understand that the health of their employees, the morale of their employees, the productivity of their employees, is all wrapped up in inclusion. And inclusion is not something that is reserved for equity-seeking groups. Of course, when we refer to it, we often refer to it that way. But inclusion is a basic human hardwired requirement that we all have to
Right.
feel safe and belong to an organization. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I oftentimes will use the word acknowledgement. We all have a need to be acknowledged for who we are, how we show up, what we say, what we offer, what we contribute. And to me, that is part of the inclusion. That is, being part of something. And we're human beings. We're not intended to be isolationists, or hermits, shall we say? That's a very, very small percentage of the population. And so, as a whole, we have a need to be part of something. And so when we're not valued, when we're not acknowledged for, the role that we play, the contributions we make, it feels, it feels unjust. And so that ties back to the fairness. One thing I heard, and I'll share this video with you later, something I use in my cultural competency course I teach for California State University, uh, going beyond race and ethnicity. But there's a good little, video clip that talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, here in the States. And we talked about diversity really being more of the quantitative assessment of who are we as an organization? What are we made of? And then where equity comes into play, it's more of the qualitative aspect in terms of ensuring, fair access, and then it goes into the inclusion. And so inclusion is even a broader sense of that qualitative thing. So all the things you just mentioned a few minutes ago. And so it's really the quality of life that is borne out by not only equity, but definitely inclusion.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you have noticed this, but there's a new term that's emerging, I think, across North America, and that is belonging.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
so, like inclusion might be an act that doesn't accomplish belonging. It could be an act for the purpose of taking a box or whatever it is, right? But belonging is where we're really trying to get at, right? For in terms of accomplishing fairness, accomplishing psychological safety, and and morale and productivity and everything else, right?
Right. Yeah, and there's a couple of things that I'd like to build upon. I know we talked about a little bit pre recording here, but you mentioned that it's predictable, it's manageable, it's you can analyze the cost of it. And so and that was one of the things Dr. Dan Dana brought to light is I know several factors on how to manage the cost of conflict, and oftentimes organizations don't even know they are spending that money. And so there are two things here is that how do you in today's world measure the systems that manage conflict in the workplace, but then also I know you have developed what's called a workplace fairness assessment, and so talk to us a little bit more about both of those elements.
Sure. So building partly on what Dr. Dana's pioneered in with his work, we developed a tool that we call the fairness cost analysis tool, and it goes somewhat beyond just sort of the cost of conflict to look at such things as reputational cost and
Mhm.
and that sort of thing, but interestingly enough, over the years, we have started to see this come to fruition in some workplaces in Canada. And so a good example of this is the city of Edmonton, which is a city in Alberta in Canada. And they had many troubles in their workplace, and because Canada is a fairly heavily regulated, workplaces are fairly heavily regulated, there's a duty to investigate where things go off the rails.
Mhm.
And in this case, the investigation had to run so deep that it cost them $1 million.
Hmm.
And this
Talk
led
about the
them,
cost of conflict.
yeah, well, exactly. And so this led them to start thinking, we are doing this in completely the wrong way. So they set up a workplace restoration department,
Hmm.
an actual department of the city. It's got 5 or 6 workplace restoration practitioners who are working full time there. And they're doing all kinds of work. They're doing proactive work and so on. And yeah, I know that organizations in the United States, many of them have similar functions like ombuds offices and
Mhm.
that sort of thing, right? And often how these offices or departments arise is out of some dramatic event, right? Something has happened, right?
Mhm.
In some cases with the ombuds function, it's a little bit different because there was historically in the United States, there were 2 organizations. One of them was University Ombuds Functions that were sort of outward looking and involved students and so on. And somewhat the same in Canada with banks and that sort of thing. But for many organizations, they decide that they have to spend a bunch of money on managing conflict because they've seen the downside. They've looked over the cliff and they don't like what's at the bottom
Hmm.
of it. But the reality is, very few organizations systematically look at conflict as a cost, even though they're spending, in some cases, millions of dollars on the tip of the iceberg, the direct costs. Some organizations, unionized organizations with unions in Canada, they're spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on grievance arbitrations.
Yeah.
A proactive approach to conflict could save a lot of that money. Not all of it, but a lot of that money. And this sort of brings us to the piece that really got us going with to start with the Workplace Fairness Institute and evolving into Workplace Fairness International. And that is, we can actually identify the measures in the workplace that reduce the risk of conflict and manage conflict as it arises, and we can evaluate them, and for the purpose of improving them so that there's continuous improvement, right? So that they, the more they improve, the lower the cost of conflict becomes, the healthier their workplace participants are, and that's not just employees, but also CEOs and people who have to deal with the ramifications of largely negative conflict in their organizations. And a large part of that comes down to a very simple understanding about the relationship between fairness and conflict. That if you understand that virtually all negative conflict is the product of perceptions of unfairness, if you just buy that piece, then you could devise all kinds of strategies to reduce the perception of unfairness in the workplace, right?
Yes.
Communication, collaboration, health-based processes, making sure that when conflict does arise, it's managed swiftly and efficiently and fairly for people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, having said that, we also know, and I think Dan, sort of warned me of this about 20 years ago, that if it's not measured, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line with this stuff. And while that is happening, there have been surveys and that have pointed to the costs here. Like, for example, in 2007, the Level Playing Field Institute in the United States conducted a survey of 14,000 professionals. And keep in mind the year 2007, just before the big market crash.
Right.
They said that on the basis of scientifically valid extrapolation, 2 million professionals a year leave their job for one reason only: unfairness, at the cost of $37 billion to those organizations. And so any organization, and now there is a huge massive war for talent in organizations across North America, and I can attest to this personally. I've got 2 children. They're 35 years old. They make their decisions about where they work primarily on the basis of how well and fairly they feel treated.
Right.
And my son, who's a cybersecurity expert, he's not feeling it from his organization. He's applying out. He's had 3 interviews this week. He's going to be gone.
Yeah.
And it's because this organization hasn't thought it through. How do you keep somebody like that, right?
Right. I'm glad you brought that point up, and I remember talking about our kids way back in the day. And yeah, that the younger generation, your kids, my kids who are still in their late 20s, they value and base their decisions on where they work on very different factors than what you or I and people older than us and younger than us have been doing. And so it's sort of like I was going to say wake up America, but wake up North America, wake up world. We can't keep running businesses the way we have and expect that we're going to have a committed, loyal workplace who's committed to quality and production and services and all that kind of stuff. If they in turn are not feeling valued in terms of the quality of what they bring to the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. There is, organizations who get this right. They have, some pretty significant long-term benefits for them. And I've seen this all over the place, and I've seen what happens when organizations get it wrong. And sometimes getting it wrong means short-term shareholder value. But at the expense of the longer term health of their organization, of their company. And and it's like all that stuff is quite preventable. And this stuff can be, fairness can achieve without opening up the vault in an organization. It's not about how much money you spend on things. It's about what your priorities are.
Right. And that's something I oftentimes will emphasize to my clientele, whether it's one-on-one, small group, organizational, whatever. But it's the small stuff in our behaviors and in our attitudes and how we show up with people that make all the difference. You know, I don't need to be the richest, most famous, leading company in the world, but if I show up in a way that treats people with respect, with dignity, that I acknowledge their cares and concerns and their contributions and their input, what a different world that is. And, it's small stuff that people, it's not rocket science. We can make a big difference in small ways. We just need to do it consistently, proactively, and effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a good example of this is there are organizations that they do have litigation budgets,
Mhm.
and perhaps more so in the United States for court litigation, and often in Canada for sort of arbitration and that sort of litigation. But they do have budgets for this.
Mhm.
If they took, let's say, 10% of that budget,
Yeah,
and they devoted it to training leaders how to be leaders of people rather than managers of work,
right.
that budget could be reduced in half,
Yes.
because all of the incidents that have led to people leaving and suing, people doing it, what in Canada is called human rights complaints. I think it's something different in the United States, which are hugely expensive litigation, like unbelievable costs. And in Canada, one of the federal government departments estimated that in total they spend an average of about $100,000 per investigation. And when you think about that, $100,000 for that organization, one investigation, they could have trained all of their leaders on how to be better leaders, and
Yeah.
probably cut those investigations in half.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, there's two things I want to comment on. Is that one is um, uh, talk about pouring money down a rabbit hole, never recoverable, right? And then two is that you talked earlier, and I want to come back to this um, trauma informed approach, and you mentioned trauma in the workplace, and so say a little bit more about that, because that's changed the field of psychology and how we treat people and approach people in terms of there's lots of traumas in lots of different ways, but I don't know that we've really been talking about organizationally.
Yeah, so this is uh, the application of a trauma-informed approach to fairness, systems analysis, and design comes from uh, the definition of conflict. What is it? It's a perceived injurious event.
Yeah.
So you pile these small injuries up and they become complex trauma.
Mm.
And so even people who you would want to participate in a process like this, they don't feel safe. This is not a psychologically safe place to contribute, in
Mm.
their view. Uh, Part of that could be perception, and part of it could be, quite reasonably held perception, right? And so a trauma-informed approach is not much different than what we have been doing in the ADR world as it relates to conflict management systems analysis and design,
Mm.
because the main features of a trauma-informed approach are empowerment, involvement, recognition. You're hearing some pretty similar terms here.
Mm.
Folger and Bush's promise of mediation,
Right.
right? Empowerment and recognition. These are a part of easing the fear related to participation. So when we get into conflict, we become weak and self-absorbed,
Mm. Mm.
and that both the weakness and the self-absorption are defense mechanisms for us to help us stay out of trouble, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how we're hardwired, right? And
Hmm.
a trauma-informed approach would understand that uh, um, virtually everybody in the workplace who experiences conflict is going to experience some injury.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that this is not the kind of trauma that a first responder gets when they watch somebody getting run over by a car or something. It's not
Right.
that kind
Right.
of trauma. It is this small incremental stuff that works away at you.
Hmm.
Now, that's not to say that there aren't significantly single incident traumatic effects in workplaces across North America. Of course, there are. Um, but the trauma informed approach that we're talking about is not, is not directed specifically at that. It's directed more generally at the kinds of principles,
Hmm.
recognizing, realizing, accommodating, making people feel safe, creating
Hmm.
safe environments, that sort of thing, right?
Okay. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. Oh, you know what, Blaine, I could keep on talking to you forever, but I'm sure that we'll go way deeper than what our audience would probably care to hear. But I want to make sure that they are aware because you have generously offered a 20% discount on your 10 module e-learning program that provides a detailed approach for identifying conflict and evaluating conflict management systems. And so tell our viewers and listeners where they can gain access to this, and we'll definitely put it into our show notes as well.
Yeah, so yeah, you can go to our site, workplacefairness.ca, and click on the e-learning tab, and there's a full explanation of the different e-learning offerings that we have, and we're talking about what we call the bronze offering, which is 10 modules that cover conflict analysis, culture analysis, system identification, evaluation, but also um, how to write a report,
Okay. Wow.
how to assess the cost of conflict, how to internally market in your organization the need for this stuff, the value proposition, and so this is something that we've been delivering as live training for the past
Okay.
15 years. And we do public offering live training at least twice a year, and we're going to expand that quite a bit as we move into the United States. But the e-learning, many have found that the e-learning in and of itself really prepares people to get started on this journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's especially useful for HR practitioners,
Hmm.
for ombuds folks, ADR practitioners,
Hmm.
and for those who are sort of private practitioners who want to offer this
Hmm.
service
Hmm.
with their workplaces. So
Yeah.
yeah, and we really think that this is a good adjunct. It's a really good professional development opportunity for people,
Hmm.
and a good opportunity to add another tool to the toolkit. Right?
Yeah. Yep. Well, as you were talking, Blaine, I thought, you know what? A definite marketing strategy should be to reach out to all of those uh, uh, finance executives, the
Mhm.
CFOs, and the certified financial planners who work with organizations. Because boy, you want to look good in front of your corporate client. Talk about how much money you can save by shifting the way we look at conflict, right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. In fact, we did talk in front of the Canadian Certified Public Accountants
Okay.
organization just a month ago. And yeah, and it was about that, about how, the predictability of it, and how, like, why don't you have a line item in your budget
Yeah,
for
yeah,
this, right? You
yeah,
have it for investigations.
yeah,
Why don't you have it for this, right?
yeah, yeah. Well, on that note, and I know we'll wrap up here, but when you think about one, a lot of people still don't know about the value of mediation and what that's all about. But really, if you look at dispute resolution, is really on a continuum. And
Mhm.
so, the first level is, I've got a conflict, I've got an issue with you, and how do I negotiate with you directly? How do we resolve this? And then we move up into third party assisted devices like conciliation and mediation, and then going into arbitration. And arbitration starts getting on the adjudication side, but in there too is litigation. And then before we get to the full court press, with the judge and the adjudication. And so it depends on the type of conflict, but too many times people, and like you said earlier, have these huge budgets for litigation. But imagine if they had a budget for dispute resolution, of which litigation, and only about 2 or 3% of cases ever actually go to court, at least in the US.
Right.
And so, but they cost hugely. They cost hugely,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And so,
Like, just take some money, take some of that, huge budget for your court costs, invest it in the things that are going to reduce the risk of
mhm.
conflict from arising in the first place. And you're going to save yourself a lot of money.
Oh, huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not to mention equipping people with the skills and how to effectively negotiate with one another, for managers, how to, effectively manage people differences and disputes and bring it to resolution, and going on from there. Well, okay, now I'm getting off on the cost of conflict. So, oh man, it just drives me crazy when I see what organizations pay on stuff. It's just like, oh man. But I am so delighted, Blaine. We finally have come together. You can see I'm passionate also about changing the way we look at conflict. And between what you're doing, I know I'm involved in another nonprofit organization called Kids Managing Conflict. Imagine a world of where our leaders already know how to deal with
Yeah.
conflict. Think about the synergy that we can accomplish. So I love what you're doing, and I want to encourage people to take advantage of your wonderful 20% discount on your 10 module program. Look it up again, workplacefairness.ca, and get more information. Join in. We'll put the URL into our show notes as we get published here. And boy, my kindred spirit. I knew we hit it off 20 years ago, and we still are here. Okay, thank you, Dr. Dan Dana.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, lifelong friendships have emerged and evolved, and so I'm really excited about our continued collaboration, and particularly as hopefully branch into the U.S. market and see where we go. There's just so much that can be done, and so many opportunities. I just want to shake people sometimes and just wake up and look at what's going on around you. So let's continue partnering, Blaine. And
Okay.
again, Workplace Fairness International. I'm glad you've gone the big scale. So thank you, Blaine.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. And thank you, all of our listeners and viewers. Dr. Debra Dupree, founder and host of Decoding the Conflict Mindset. Think about how you can shift the mindset about somebody in your sphere of influence, about how to take a look at conflict, particularly in the workplace, and how we can do it differently. Imagine a better world of managing conflict. Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 65 with Blaine Donais, founder and president of the Workplace Fairness International. Blaine brings to the world of conflict resolution and understanding people in conflict is really brilliant and poignant, very important to share. I'm so excited to see him launching the online program available for employers to take a deeper dive into what's going on in their organization and to learn about things that can be done to shift that culture of toxicity, moving away from bad bossing. and really embracing a mindset for a culture of inclusion where people are treated fairly, feel valued, and feel heard. After all, as human beings, we seek to be respected and respect others. And for many of us, the bottom line is all about fairness. After all, who likes to be treated unfairly? So, building on our theme of workplace conflict issues, I am delighted to bring to you as our next guest in just 2 more weeks, Angela Reddick Wright. Now, Angela is a legend in her own time, having 30 years of being a litigator and then moving into the field of mediation over the last 15 years and becoming a full-time mediator just 5 years ago. But she knows conflict. She has an interesting personal history that feeds into her dedication and passion about fairness, people being treated equitably, and how that shows up in the workplace. And so Angela will be our next guest speaker, and she's just a delightful person, has a great smile, and that's what attracted her to me when I first met with her at a professional conference in Los Angeles a number of years ago. So Angela is not only a well sought after mediator, but she also has a weekly radio show called Legal Lens with Angela on Tavis Smiley's KBLA Talk 1580. So check her out, see what she has to offer, and I'm sure you'll be back to listen to her live interview in just 2 more weeks.